We're going to now do our lesson in how to prepare for a small group Bible study. And this is in your assignment number 5 in your manuals. And so I want you to turn there and I want to go over exactly what we're going to do in this particular assignment. Now up to this point, we've just been outlining and charting our text. But now what we're going to do is we're going to prepare a Bible study with what we've learned from our outlining and charting. And what I want to do now is just to give you some insights here. First of all, one of the things that we want to note is that this kind of a Bible study is, I believe, one of the best ways to disciple people. Because what you're going to do is you're going to lead them through the text to find what the text says. And then you're going to lead them to find what does it mean. And then you're going to lead them to find how they can apply it to their lives. And so when it comes to getting people into a small group, one of the best ways to do this is get some friends. Maybe you can do it with your family, but wherever you are, gather a small group of people together. Now, I'm talking about 12 or less. Now, good small group size is, you don't want to go over 12, and I believe Jesus understood that because he had 12 disciples. But anytime you get over 12, what you're going to do is you're going to find a certain group dynamic will change. I have a lot of information in the manual. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but that on small group dynamics and so forth. But when you get into a group, you want the group to have enough. You don't want it too big so that you can't get people all involved. You want to get everybody in the group involved in the discussion. So what we're doing is I'm going to lead them in a discussion that is going to help them to discover the truths of a text. I'm not going to tell them what the text says. I'm going to guide them into it and help them to find what the text is saying and what does it mean, and then, of course, the application. But I think this is one of the best kinds of studies that you can ever get involved in. And I really prefer, over preaching to an audience, I prefer the small group, because it's in that small group that you can interact and you can get people to interact with you and talk and raise questions. Now, like on a Sunday morning, when the pastor says something and it's not clear, you can't raise your hand and say, "Pastor, wait a minute, you just lost me. Can you say that again in a different way?" You're not going to ask a question in church like that with a large group. But with a small group, when you don't understand something, you can say, "Hey, I didn't get that. What do you mean by that?" And so you can interact. And again, this is probably one of the best ways to get people discipled in the Word, because they have a chance to ask questions when they don't understand something. And so you can walk them through until they get the idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to chart our text here. And we're going to do a little bit of, after we've outlined it, and I'll go over the outline with you in just a little bit. But after you've outlined it, then you're going to go through and you begin to break your text apart. But we're going to chart differently now than what we've been doing before, because I'm going to use my chart now to prepare for a study. And so what I'm going to do is, as I write my observation down, I'm going to leave a space every time in my chart after I've made an observation, because I'm going to come back later and I'm going to make up questions. And so I'm going to get my group to look at specific things that I see in the text as I work it through in my chart. So I'm going to make sure I leave room so I can come back and draw up my questions. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to go through and read the text carefully. And then I want you just to break apart, make a very quick little outline. And then I want you to start charting the text. And you'll see how I began with verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. All right? And so as I made my observation there, one of the key things that I picked up right away was this word "made." You see that? He didn't ask for volunteers. He didn't say, "Hey, how many of you would like to get into the boat and go to the other side, and I got a little surprise waiting for you in the middle of the lake." He didn't say that. He just said, "Get into the boat." He made them get in the boat. So Jesus uh, commands the disciples to go across the sea. Okay, so I'm making an interpretation. He made his disciples get in the boat and go before him to the other side. All right, and so I'm making just a real simple interpretation there, and then I could think of an application there. I will obey the commands of Jesus. All right? So I just brought myself into it. Obviously, he commanded the disciples, and when he commands me, I likewise want to obey. All right, so that's what we're going to start with. First, go through, outline it, and then I want you to begin charting the text, and then we'll get into a little bit more about what we're going to do once we've done the charting first. Don't think about any questions yet. Just chart the information first, and then we'll come back and talk about how to raise up questions from your chart. All right, so that's the first part that we're going to do in this assignment. All right, now I'd like to just show you the outline, how I'd like you to outline it first, just a simple breakdown of the text, and then we'll get into the chart here a little bit and formulating our questions. So first of all, the first thing that I pick up from verse 45 and 46 is the idea that Jesus is going to send the disciples away, and he's going to go to the mountain to pray. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that he's going to take them through some lessons of faith versus fear in verses 47 to 51. And then he's going to talk, the text is going to talk about verse 52 that has a hardened heart is the big problem with the disciples. So that's just a real simple little breakdown. When I work with a narrative, just try to break down the basic ideas of it, and then you're going to get into your chart. And so as I get into my chart now, starting with verse 45, okay, I'm going to get the participants to look at the different observations, interpretations, and so you're going to take time to go through and chart all those verses. Once you've done that, then we come back and we're going to work on formulating questions. So if you'll look in your manual there on that fifth assignment, you'll see some information about formulating inductive questions. I just want to go over that with you for a little bit as you then go through and begin to write up your questions. All right, when you're learning to write inductive questions, you're learning a skill. As with any activity, your skill level in developing questions will improve with practice. The first big step is doing a thorough and methodical study of the passage. Through your questions, the study group is going to find what you found. Surface study will yield surface questions and discussions. Thorough study will yield questions that involve the group with strong truths of the passage so they are moved to God in His ways. This kind of result is well worth the time and effort of careful study. All right, first of all, study with yourself in mind. What does God want to teach me in this particular time? And then what about others? What does He want to gain? What can we gain for our lives as we study together and so forth? So always bring yourself into it first as you're preparing your study. Lord, what are you saying to me? Because if God is not speaking to you, you're going to have a hard time getting people to hear from God, because first He's going to speak to you as you prepare this study. And so always think of, what is God trying to say to me? Don't just think about your group and, boy, yeah, this person really has that problem and this will really help them, that kind of thing. Don't do that. All right. When you finish studying, look over your chart and mark points of special significance that you want to be sure to include. All right, so there's specific things. I will chart lots of information, but I may not include everything that I chart as I get into my study with the group. All right, formulating your questions. Your questions should lead the group into the main stream of thought in the passage so they will discover the major points and apply them to their lives. It's important to remember what type of group you're working with: new converts, more mature, young, older. The group will not need to go through the detailed analysis you did. Your questions will assume from them certain basics of structure, which you dug out in your preparation. So you want to start with, first of all, survey kinds of questions that will get them acquainted with the whole passage. Who's involved? Where are they? What are they doing? So forth. These are, especially with narrative text, survey types of questions work very nicely at the beginning. So who are the people involved in the story? Just getting them to look at the overall story, that kind of thing. Through your questions, lead them in sequence through the passage from the beginning to the end. You may want to lead them to study section by section so that they, as they move along, they'll get to see the connections between the paragraphs. You're going to ask three kinds of questions in this. You're going to ask observation, fact questions. Then you're going to ask interpretation, meaning questions. And then thirdly, application, action questions. How are they going to apply this to their lives? All right, and so you're going to ask three kinds of questions. And notice on the next page there, you've got some more information about how to ask observation questions, interpretation questions, and application questions. Get the group to observe what's there. By various means, lead them to see who, what, when, where. They may need to describe some of the people or the scenes, help them to get into the scene themselves, reliving an event or a conversation, or putting themselves in the place of the people in the first century Ephesus receiving a letter from the Apostle Paul. Lead the group to see some of the structure that you found, so forth. All right, so that's observation. The interpretation questions, get the group to analyze by asking why. Now that's one of your better questions when you're interpreting is, why did Jesus say that? Or why did the disciples respond the way they responded? They will need to define some key words or phrases, help them to see the reasons behind some of the structure, ask questions based on your own work from the interpretation column of your charting. This is also a way of leading them to see the connections between the paragraphs. When they find a main truth, your question should help them to think it through. So that's the key as I'm working through the text. I want them to think through what they're observing there. What's the point that we're really trying to draw through? And then application questions. Get the group to think about the plan of change that needs to be made in their personal lives, attitudes, relationships, actions. Application questions should flow naturally from the meaning of the main points. They should appear after a crucial point has been made clear. Keep in mind, though, it's more important to have, more effective to have a few good application questions scattered throughout the passage than maybe to have too many. And you can go overboard with your application questions if you're not careful. So I want to work with the text. And so what I'm going to do now, you've all gone through and done your charting. And so I'm going to take the verses, and remember we've left a little slot here. And so what I'm going to come back is I'm going to ask some questions here. All right? And so the first question, for example, that I would ask here, when it says immediately he made his disciples get into the boat, I asked the question, what did Jesus do with his disciples? All right? Or what did he do after the feeding of the 5,000? Now, one of the things that I would want to do is I would want to quickly review at the beginning of my study what happened just before. Now, if I'm working in sequence through the Gospel of Mark, that would be very important to give the context. Each week, I'm going to go back and review a little bit of what we talked about the week before. In the week before, we learned about the feeding of the 5,000 and the miracle of Jesus multiplying the loaves and so forth. And so immediately after that, after Jesus fed the 5,000, the disciples collected the 12 baskets full, he sent the disciples out to get into the boat and go before him to the other side. And so that's the first question observation question I would ask. What did Jesus do? Well, here's your answer here. This is what I'm looking for as I ask that question. All right. Now, secondly, I would say, did Jesus, in my interpretation here, did Jesus ask or command the disciples? All right, so here's an interpretive question. Did he ask the disciples, or did he command them to go? And obviously the word made is a command. He didn't ask for volunteers. All right, so then I could think about an application question here. Okay, I talked about, okay, well, I'm going to obey the commands of Jesus. And I would ask a question, are you willing to obey the commands of Jesus? All right, so there's my question. Are you willing to obey the commands of Jesus? And so, again, you want the group to think through about the commands of Jesus. You know, when he gives you a command, and what happens if he gives you a command that's really hard to do? You know, are you still going to do it? You know, so you can talk about that a little bit in the group about obeying him when he commands us to do something. All right. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question about where he was sending them. And so we know that this particular thing is taking place on the Sea of Galilee. And let me just draw a little bit of a sea here. All right, so we know that the Sea of Galilee, it's about approximately 13 miles long. And at the widest point of the Sea of Galilee, it's about 7 miles wide. So it's not a huge body of water, but it's not too little either. Bethsaida is right up in this area up here. Capernaum's over here. All right, and so just give it an idea, and it's helpful to have a map or at least do a drawing to kind of give people an idea. Now, we're not exactly sure where the disciples were, but I think they were up somewhere in this area here, and so they're going to have to go across the sea. So he sends them to Bethsaida. So I want to ask the question now, where did Jesus send the disciples? All right, so I want them to look at that. All right, where did Jesus send the disciples? All right, so again, there's my answer, you know. All right, we know that Bethsaida is in the northeastern part of the Sea of Galilee. All right, so he's in the northeastern part of the Sea of Galilee. All right, so my observation question, where did Jesus send them? There's the answer that I'm looking for. And then where is Bethsaida? All right, so again, I'm making an interpretive question. I just want to know where it is. And if they don't know, again, the map, drawing a map or getting them to look at their Bibles to find where Bethsaida is, it helps a great deal. Okay, so the next thing that we're told in the text, it says, while he sent the multitude away. And so my observation question would be, what did Jesus do with the crowd? You know, what happened to the crowd after he had sent the disciples away? All right, so I would write my observation question and the interpretation that I would want to look at there. Jesus has authority over the crowd. Okay. Now, again, you want to think about it. How difficult, after feeding those 5,000 plus, how difficult would it be to send them away? They've got a full stomach now. And he's working miracles. People are being healed. There's just all kinds of things going on. It would not be easy to do. So you ask yourself, how in the world did he get them away? Well, you see, Jesus has authority. And he has authority over the people. And when he told them to go, they obeyed him. They followed him. All right? And so, again, I can think through for myself about how much authority, when does Jesus have authority over my life? I could put down, I could say, Jesus has authority over me. All right, so there's my observation, interpretation, application. And so if I'm asking a question here, what did Jesus do with the crowd? All right. All right, so there's the observation, and why did the crowd go? Why would they go? How much authority does Jesus have over my life? All right, so do you see what I'm doing here? I'm just making, from my observations that I've drawn on my chart, and I go through all the verses, and I'm just then going to make up as many questions as I can think. And this is just an exercise in formulating questions. Now, I may not use all those questions once I get ready, but once I've gone through and I've done all my charting, then I'm going to go back through and I'm going to make a list of questions that I'm going to ask from my chart. And again, I may ask a ton of questions here, but I'm going to come back and then I'm going to tie together the questions that I want to ask as I lead my Bible study group. Now, again, you want to keep in mind the group that you're working with. If they're really new believers, then you've got to be careful with your questions and make sure that they're working with the text carefully. If you're working with younger children, then you can still interact with them, but you're going to have to simplify it maybe just a little bit. But it's a wonderful way to get people to think about God's Word, what God has said, and what does He mean, and how can you apply that to your life. So I want you to take some time now and just go through and make up all your questions. And once you've done that, then we'll review the entire study, okay? So let's take a little time to do that. Okay. All right, now we're going to go through the text with you. We've already covered verse 45. But now we're going to pick up on the next verse, and we're going to go through verse by verse, and I'm going to show you how you can make up your questions for your Bible study. And so the first thing, as we mentioned, Jesus had sent his disciples away, and so we asked the question, what did Jesus do with his disciples? And we said that he had commanded his disciples to go in our interpretation. So I asked the interpretive question, did Jesus ask or command the disciples to go? And then we talked about the fact that I would be willing to obey the commands of Jesus. And are you willing to obey the commands of Jesus? So there's just my observation and then my interpretation and my application from verse 45. And then in verse 52, it says he sent them to Bethsaida. Actually, that's in verse 45 still. And and so we ask the question, where did Jesus send the disciples? And where is Bethsaida? So forth, the northeastern part of the Sea of Galilee, as we pointed out before. Okay, so next it says, while he sent the multitude away. So what did Jesus do with the crowd? Well, he sent them away. And why did the crowd go? Well, because Jesus has authority over the crowd, and Jesus has authority over me. So I asked, how much authority does Jesus have over your life or my life? And so that's the first verse, 45. So starting in verse 46, it says, and when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. So in my observation column, I would write that whole verse out, all right, because we've already talked about sending them away. But it says he departed to the mountain to pray. So my observation question would be, what did Jesus do after he sent the multitude away? All right, he went to the mountain to pray. So my interpretation now, I want to ask the question, why did Jesus go to the mountain to pray? Well, he went there because he needed to pray. He was fully human, just like you and I. And because of his humanness, he needed to pray. We know that he was also fully God, but in the humanness of man, we need to spend time in prayer. It's an important thing. And Jesus continually would go out and spend time in prayer. And the disciples were observing that. He was demonstrating for them. By the way, in discipleship, demonstration is the best way to teach people, by your very life. And they saw him going out. He went out to pray. And you think about, okay, now what would Jesus pray about? Well, we know that one thing that he probably would be praying about, again, the text doesn't tell us, but one thing that I'm pretty certain he would be praying about, it was from verse 52. It tells us that the hearts of the disciples were hardened because they didn't understand what had just happened previously. So they've got this hardened heart, and I think Jesus would be praying for them. And I could just hear him pray something like this. You know, Father, I know I picked those 12, but man, they are really a pain to me right now. They're really not getting it, you know, something like that. But again, we don't know what he prayed. But you know, in just his humanness, I think he would pray about it, maybe his physical condition. Lord, Father, give me strength. You know, just like you and I pray. You put yourself into the shoes of the characters in any narrative text, and you try to identify with them a little bit. And certainly, we know our own humanness and things that we ask for when we go to prayer, and so I'm sure that they were also involved in praying similar types of things. All right. And so then I would go to application there, and I would ask a question, how important is prayer to you? Are you willing to take time on a regular basis to pray? If Jesus needed to pray, how much more important it is that we pray? And so just getting my small group to discuss that a little bit about the importance of their own prayer life. And again, we're not legalistic. You know, you need to spend at least 4 hours a day on your knees in prayer. You know, there's nowhere in the Bible that says to do that, but we do need to pray. And hopefully you are spending time on a regular basis going out and just getting alone with the Father and praying. You know, when I drive my car on the freeways, I'm praying a lot. You know, sometimes I pray against the guy that just cut in front of me. But prayer is a very important tool to all of us. All right. Now, we're told in verse 47, now the evening came and the boat was in the middle of the sea and he was alone on the land. So I would ask an observation question there about the evening time. What time was the boat in the middle of the sea when Jesus saw it? Well, the text says it was in the evening time, all right? Or in the evening time, where was the boat? Well, it was in the middle of the sea. So again, you see, I'm just getting them to look and make the observation of that, where the boat was, okay? Because that's going to be an important element of time that we want to look at a little bit later. All right? And then it says he was alone on the land, so I just asked simple observation question, where was Jesus at this time? And the text tells us he was still alone on the land. All right, verse 48. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. All right, so the first observation I'm going to make now from verse 48 is what was happening with with the disciples. And what did Jesus see happening with the disciples? He saw them straining at rowing, all right? And so I could ask another question, well, what was happening? Why were they straining at rowing? Oh, well, the text says the wind was against them. And then I could think about a little application here, and I'd say, have you ever felt like the wind is against you? Do you ever feel like the disciples must have felt that day when they were rowing the boat, and man, they're just not getting anywhere. They're trying to go somewhere, and they just can't go. And you have to ask yourself the question, were the disciples being obedient to the command of Jesus? And the answer is yes, they were. But they couldn't get there because of that storm. Well, there's a lot of times in my life that I will feel like the wind is against me. And I just feel like I can't go anywhere. I'm trying to do what Jesus wants me to do. And so I feel like that also sometimes about the wind against them. All right, so I've made an observation there about the wind. I've made an interpretation, and I brought myself into it also at that point. All right, now the next thing, it says about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. So the observation question would be something like, when did Jesus come to the disciples there? All right, and we know it's in the fourth watch. So I would have to ask an interpretive question there. When is the fourth watch? And most people probably wouldn't know unless they've got a study Bible that gives them some insight. But the fourth watch was early in the morning, between 3 and 6 a.m. And so we know there's 4 watches in the night. The first started at 6 p.m. The second started, it goes from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The second is from 9 p.m. to midnight. From midnight to 3 a.m. is the third watch, and the fourth watch is then 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so Jesus came to them in the fourth watch, all right? So it was somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. And so I'm going to ask a question that, it deals with the time element here. Because I would say, when did Jesus see the disciples in trouble? Well, it was in the evening watch, that first watch somewhere. All right, so they were in the middle of the sea, and we know that he sent them out late in the day. So right after the feeding of the 5,000, he told them to get in a boat and go over towards Bethsaida. And so, they got in the boat, so it had to have been late in the afternoon, maybe just before the first watch. And so they've moved out into the middle of the sea. And again, the sea is only about 7 miles wide, so they're out in the middle somewhere out here. And they're struggling at rowing, but you'll notice he didn't come to them until somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So how many hours would that be? Let's say he saw them in the early part of the evening time struggling in the middle of the sea. So let's say around 7 p.m. he saw them struggling, and then he didn't come to them until, let's say, about 5 a.m. in the morning. How many hours is that, you mathematicians? That's 10 hours. Wow. Now, that's a long time, isn't it, to be doing this, straining at rowing. If you just tried this sometime, just do this alone without even getting an oar in the water. If you keep doing this for about 10 minutes, you know what? You're going to get pretty exhausted. Didn't take long. But think about 10 hours or 11 hours. We don't know exactly how long it was. Man, it had to have been a really big strain on them. They're straining at rowing, and Jesus comes to them in that fourth watch. Now, the next thing the text tells me, he came to them walking on the sea. So I want to get them to look at that. So the question would be, how did Jesus come to the disciples? Okay, so he comes walking on the sea. Well, how can he do that? How can Jesus walk on the sea? Well, Jesus, we know, has authority over nature. Jesus has authority over every realm of life. He has authority over men. He calls them, and they leave everything to follow him. He has authority over the physical world. He prays for the sick, and they're healed. He has authority over the demonic world. And as he teaches the word, it says he has authority over the word. And Mark chapter 1 talks about how the people marveled at his teaching because he taught with authority and not like the scribes. And so we know that he has authority over the truth, over the physical world, the spiritual world. There's nothing that he doesn't have authority over. And so he's walking on the water. And can you just picture with me now? Here he's walking on the water. He's going along, and you know, they tell me that these windstorms can become violent. We know that the Sea of Galilee is about 680 feet below sea level. That's one of the lowest places in the earth. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. The warm air from the water rises, and the winds catch it, and it creates turbulent storms, and they can happen really fast. And it's very dangerous to be caught out in the Sea of Galilee in one of these storms because they say the waves can get over 6 feet tall. I'm a little over 6 feet. And so it's a turbulent thing, and these guys, they know they can lose their life out there. And you recall some of the other stories where the waves were coming in over the boat. Jesus was in that particular boat. Said he was asleep on the stern, and the disciples came to him and woke him up in the midst of this storm and said, "Don't you care we're about to perish?" You know, in other words, how in the world can you be sleeping when we're about ready to die because the boat was filling up with water? And so obviously these storms can create very serious events where they could lose their life, and they thought they were going to die in that particular storm. So, you know, Jesus is walking in this water, and can you see the big wave coming at him? Here comes a wave, you know. Do you think he's struggling to walk through the water, you know, like he's having a hard time? No, he's got authority over that water. Here comes that wave, and I can see that wave just, you know. He doesn't have to dive underneath it like you and I'd have to do, you know. He just walks right through it. And I don't think he's having any trouble at all. And I can just see him walking along. And he gets near the boat. And can you see him? "Hi, guys. How you doing?" But he's walking near the boat. Now notice, again, very interesting, the end of verse 48, something I want to get my group to observe. See, he's walking on the sea. And it says he would have passed them by. So my question is, what did Jesus do when he got near the boat? Well, the text says he intended to pass them by. Now, if that shouldn't raise a question in your mind, you are not awake. Okay? Because immediately you should be going, why? And there's the interpretive question that I would ask. Why did Jesus intend to pass them by? Well, I believe that Jesus was looking for something here. He was looking for a response from the disciples, a response of faith. But as we know, he didn't get faith. He got the opposite of faith, which is fear. And so we see that Jesus, he was looking for them to cry out to him, "Jesus, oh, it's you. We're so glad you came. Man, we've been out here for all these hours. We are so tired and exhausted. And thank you, Jesus, for coming to rescue us right now. We're so glad you came." But he didn't get that kind of response at all. He got the very opposite of faith. In verse 49, when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed he was a ghost, and they cried out. And so, do you see the response? What kind of response did Jesus get when he's walking on the sea towards them? Well, the answer is he got a response of fear. They thought they were seeing a ghost. And the text says that they cried out, literally screamed. Can you imagine? These are grown men screaming. Some of these men are big, buff, fishermen. They made their living at the sea, and suddenly they're in big trouble. They're screaming. Now, certainly we can account for their physical condition, because if you track the story back, you realize Jesus had sent them out. They went out and ministered. They came back to Jesus. If you recall, we looked at that in Mark chapter 6, verse 30. They came back to Jesus and they reported everything they had done and taught in that story. And they had worked all kinds of miracles. And it was just, people were healed. They cast out demons. It was an amazing time. They were preaching the gospel. And Jesus observed that they were tired and they had no food, they hadn't eaten. They were so busy. And so he said, let's go to a quiet, lonely place and rest a while. So they go to that quiet, lonely place only to have thousands of people follow them. And now they got this huge crowd of people, and Jesus ends up speaking and ministering to them for a long time. And the disciples came to Jesus. This is getting late. The hour's late. Need to send these people away. There's no food here. And they're bringing up the very things that they were concerned about, the time and the food. They didn't have either one of them. They didn't get Jesus' time. They didn't get the food that they were supposed to get. And so you can understand, why these guys are really tired, and they've fed the multitudes, and they're involved in picking up 12 baskets. Well, they were doing a lot of work. By the way, culturally, it wasn't really a cool thing for them to do that, and I'm sure they were very humiliated by that, because that was not intended for them to do that kind of work, but in that culture, but they were doing it. And so they pick up that food, and now, Jesus sends them away. And they're going to send them over to Bethsaida, where they're going to finally get alone, They've had some food now, but these guys, they've been through a lot. So you can imagine how tired they would have been at this point. And now they've been straining at rowing for a long time, a lot of hours. And one of the questions is, why would Jesus let them strain so long? Well, we know that they had a hard heart. And when you have a hard heart, you can't listen. You're not open. And so Jesus has to work on their hearts. And so sometimes it takes a long time before he can get there. So now they're exhausted. They think they're seeing a ghost. And I've had that experience, where I've been totally exhausted after working in a seminar. I'll never forget, I come home from my seminar and I go to sleep that night. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden, bang, there's this loud noise. And I jump up, and I'm not sure what's going on. And I start listening, and man, there's somebody in my living room. And I immediately am thinking it's a thief, because we've had problems with theft over there. We bought our kids bikes for Christmas that my parents had sent some money over for, and they'd had the bikes for about 2 weeks, and somebody came over the fence and stole the bikes. So, theft was my first thought. Man, there's somebody coming into my house. They're stealing some stuff in my living room, and I'm hearing this noise continue in there. And so, I'm thinking, now what do I have for a weapon to fight this guy? And I'm thinking the very worst, this guy's going to be really a tough fight, and the only weapon I have is a baseball bat. I don't have a knife. I don't have a gun or anything else like that, And so I go to my door, and as I'm doing this, my heart is just pumping. It's just, I'm thinking, man, I'm going to have to fight, and it's just the very worst of the circumstances. And so, I'm sliding down the wall. I get to the door, and I'm going to open that door ever so quietly, and I can hear them now. They're across the living room over there. I can't see them because it's really dark. But now I'm going to slide down the wall here. And there's a light switch right over here. So I'm going to turn the light on. I'm not going to try to fight this guy without a light. So I slide down the wall. I get to the light switch. And I hit the light switch. And I'm ready to fight. And I look across the room over there. And it's my cat chasing a rat. And I wanted to take the baseball bat and end both of their lives right there. But I remember, you think the absolute worst. And I'm sure that's what the disciples were doing. They were thinking this is a ghost. And they said they screamed out in fear. So their response was not real good. It wasn't a response of faith at all. It was a response of fear. And then verse 50, it says, for they all saw him and were troubled. So the question would be, well, what did they see? Well, the text says they saw him, but they were troubled. Well, why were they troubled? Because they could not believe it was Jesus. They could not believe he would be walking on the water. And so the text says, and immediately he talked to them. And he said to them, be of good cheer. It is I, do not be afraid. And so the question would be then, what did Jesus do when he saw their response? Well, the text says he talked to them. So there's the observation. Well, what did Jesus say to them? Well, he said, be of good cheer. It is I. Don't be afraid. He identified himself to them. And I can just see the disciples go, oh, it's Jesus. But see, they really had a hard time believing. Now, I've often put myself into the shoes of the characters. I like to do that in narratives. And if I was in Jesus' shoes, you know what I probably would have done? I wouldn't respond very, very mercifully like Jesus did. He was very kind to them. I think I would have responded something like this: you idiots, what's your problem? How many miracles do I have to work before you're going to get it? You know, that's the kind of response I think I probably would have given them. But aren't you glad Jesus doesn't do that? Aren't you glad he doesn't blast us? We deserve it. Yeah, we're idiots. But he loves us in spite of our slowness to get things. You know, there's just a lot of times we're just like the disciples. We just don't get it, and we're just kind of moving too slow. And so Jesus talked to them, and he said, be of good cheer. What did he say to them? Be of good cheer. It is I. Don't be afraid. And then in verse 51, it says, then he went up into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. So that first part of verse 51, I would ask the observation question, what happened when Jesus got into the boat with them? And the answer, of course, is the wind stopped. And so I have to ask a very important interpretive question here. Why did the wind stop when he got into the boat? Well, we know that Jesus, wherever he goes, he brings peace. And that boat is really a picture of the disciples' lives and your life and my life. And when he gets into the boat, he brings peace. He comes into our lives. We recognize his presence, and he will bring peace to us in the midst of a storm. You know, a lot of times we go through storms and we don't feel like Jesus is around. We feel like we've been abandoned. I don't know about you, but I felt that way. I just felt like, man, I'm all alone. Jesus, where are you? What are you doing? You know, it's like he's not around. But the Bible is very clear that he will never leave us. He'll never forsake us. It's just that I don't feel like he's there. You know, those are my feelings. But my feelings aren't very accurate a lot of times. But the truth of the matter is he's there. And when I recognize his presence, he's going to bring peace to my circumstances and to my situation. And so there was a calming of the storm. Can you imagine? He gets into the boat, and immediately that wind, here's a big wave coming up, and all of a sudden, absolute silence. Can you picture what that would have been like? Now, the text says, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. So how did they respond? Well, it says they were greatly amazed and they marveled. Well, why? Why were they greatly amazed? Because they couldn't believe what Jesus had just done. They couldn't believe that he was walking on the water and then that suddenly he calms the storm. They really had a hard time. They were so amazed that this could happen. I want to ask you a question. Should we be amazed at the miracles of Jesus? Or should we live in a sense of expectancy that he's going to work a miracle in the midst of my storm? And you see, I believe that's what Jesus is teaching his disciples here. They're to live by faith and not by fear. And many times fear will grip us and it keeps us from doing what God wants us to do. Fear is a crippler. Faith sets you free to do whatever God wants you to do. And he doesn't want us to live in the sense of fear. And many times he's going to ask us to do things and we're afraid and we won't do it. We won't be obedient because we're afraid. And so Jesus, he wants us to live with a sense of expectancy. Do you understand that the disciples, were they looking for Jesus to come in the midst of their storm? Were they looking for him to rescue him? No. They were just doing it in their own power. And you know, these guys, a couple of these guys, they were pretty professional. They were made a living by the sea as fishermen, you know, and so we know that, you know, they've been in and out, and they're professional fishermen, and they're professionals on the sea, and yet even they, as professionals, couldn't handle that situation, and they cried out with everybody else. And sometimes Jesus will just let us do our thing until we're willing to hear from him. And notice it says in verse 52, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. And so we see there was a big problem. So I would ask the question, what was it? What didn't the disciples understand? Well, they didn't understand about the loaves. Well, what was it that they didn't understand about the loaves? See, what was it that Jesus was trying to teach them about the loaves, that their hearts was hardened? But you see, remember when Jesus said, well, how many loaves do you have? Remember how the disciples didn't know, and they didn't know what their resources. They went out, and all they could find is 5 loaves and 2 fish. And you remember what Jesus did? He took that, just that little bit. He took what resources they had, and he multiplied them. You see, they didn't get it. They didn't understand that when you have Jesus in your presence, he can work miracles. And when Jesus is in each of our lives, he longs to work miracles. He wants to do that work so that we can be free to follow him. And he does not want our hearts to get hardened. You see, when your heart is hardened, can you learn? No. You shut the door. And you see, the hardened heart will always hinder the work of God. And so we don't want to live with a hardened heart. We want to live by faith and trust in him. So hopefully you're getting the idea now as we've gone through the text. What we did is we charted it first, and then we went through and we made up our questions, and then we will walk through the questions with our group. Now, I have a list of questions that I wrote up. I made up about 32 questions. Now, that's a lot of questions if you're really having some pretty in-depth discussion. I have learned that you have to vary a little bit with your questions depending on the group and how much they talk. Some groups, you know, they're really chatty and they want to talk a whole lot, and so you go back and forth, and you know, so you have to guide them through, keep them moving in the text, but I have to decide how many questions I'm going to work through. And so I made a list. So here's an example of some questions that I wrote. Who are the people involved? Now, again, the first thing I would do, we haven't talked about this, but at the beginning of the study, you know, we're picking up in verse 45. Well, the story just before that is Jesus feeding of the 5,000. So that would be very important because it's brought up in our text in verse 52 that I would just go back and review that story with the group. Make sure they understood where we were in the week before. That's the last study. And so here we are in verse 45 now, going through. And so I would ask some questions about who are the people involved in the story, describe the story, tell it in your own words. So I get them to bring back the story. And then starting with verse 45, I would just begin to work through verse by verse now, working through the text. What did Jesus do with his disciples? Did he ask them or command them to go? How will we obey the commands of Jesus? Where did Jesus send them? Where is Bethsaida? What did Jesus do with the crowd? Why did the crowd go? How much authority does Jesus have over your life? And so forth. Those are the questions that I had written out that I would ask of the group as I went through my studies. So I have a finalized study that I have prepared. So I know where I'm going. And sometimes I'll get to a question and somebody in the group has already asked that question. It came up already. So I just skip it, you know, and go over to the next question, you know. So you go back and forth. But anyway, the idea is to guide the group through the text so that they get the point of the text. And again, at the end of my study, I'm going to tie in the main point, which is faith versus fear. And so I want to tie it together at the end. I want them to get it. And so we're going to talk about the importance of living by faith and not by fear and so forth. But that's how I'm going to work through it. But this is the step that I use to prepare my study. I break a text, the outline, and then we're going to go through it verse by verse. And as I lead them through each of the verses, we're going to go through verse by verse by verse. That's the way I'm going to lead the study. So this is a systematic kind of a Bible study. And I'm, again, guiding them to find the truth. I will not do all the talking. Now, some leaders, they like to talk, and so instead of, they'll ask a question and they'll wait 30, maybe about 10 seconds and nobody answers, so they'll answer it. Well, you don't want to answer your own questions. So you ask a question, and if they don't answer it right away, you give them a little bit of time to think about it, but sometimes they're not getting it, so then I need to rephrase it and say it again in a different way. But it's important, again, to just walk them through step by step, verse by verse, and get them to see what's there, and then what does that mean, and then bring application. And so by the time you've got through with the study, they're really getting the point, but you know what you're doing with the group? You're teaching them how to study. And they're going to learn as they go through that. That's the way I learned it. I just had a guy that was taking us through a text inductively like this when I was originally with InterVarsity in those early days. And man, I tell you, I just learned that inductive system. I caught the system because that's what he was doing. He was making observations, interpretations, applications. Now, you listen to the next time you listen to somebody teach the word expositionally, that's what they're doing. As they go through verse by verse, they're making observations, interpretations, and applications. That's what exposition is all about. But it's this inductive system of getting them to observe, interpret, and apply. So hopefully you're getting the idea of how we make up a Bible study for a small group. And the thing I want to encourage you to do is to go home and practice this. Practice on your family. It's a good place to start, or get a couple of your good friends and just sit them down and walk them through the Bible study. But you got to practice this if you're going to lead an effective study. And it's going to take time. And there'll be times you'll just shake your head and go, man, I remember the first Bible study I did, I walked away just going, that was awful. But, I learned over the period of time what works. And it's a process. But you got to practice like anything else. The more you practice, the better you get at it. I used to coach football. And I work with my players. We got a playbook of plays. And we didn't have a lot of plays in the playbook. But we worked those plays over and over and over again to the point where they knew exactly what they were to do on every circumstance, every situation in the game situation. And that's what we're trying to get you to do here. Practice until you've really got it down. And once you get this down, I tell you what, there's nothing better than getting people into the Word. Okay, so hopefully this has really been a helpful lesson to you.